I've had the complete delight and joy of speaking with Guy Sengstock multiple times over the years, and I always find it a really delightful experience. He always brings tremendous insight to whatever topic we get into, and we've gotten into many different topics about about issues too that I think are really important. That matter today, whether it be the meaning crisis, whether it be the nihilism that's going on, whether it be the interesting dynamics that emerge between people when they relate on a deep level, when they're really open to one another. I'm really fascinated by that phenomenology, by that experience. I've been thinking a lot about how a lot of philosophy has been seeking, they've always sought like the presuppositions by which people occupy. But what's so interesting about your work, guys, I see this kind of field of intersuppositions, or these kind of suppositions that arise between people according to which we're trying to think now and
Yep.
today. And I find that really fascinating. I love your series with Daniel Zaruba. I adore Daniel Zaruba. The John Rawson, those were so good. What a great guy.
Oh,
Wow.
Rawson. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man, those were cool. And the
Yeah.
Altmassa. I don't pronounce. You've been doing these readings
Albus.
on
Yeah. The
Albus.
recent ones was eight. Almost. Yeah.
Excellent,
hmm
excellent. Well, Guy, it's great to have you. And what have you been thinking about lately? Where's your mind been going? Because what you've been thinking about is always something that I find very, very lush and full of potential.
Sweet.
So I'm curious where your thoughts have been these days, Guy.
Well, they've been, as we were just talking a little bit before, a few different things. So in cracking open Almas again,
Mm,
um, which I haven't read in about like with any seriousness, like it's been probably about 5 years,
mm,
and being reminded and seeing his work more deeply than I think I saw it before, and appreciated actually how I always thought he was philosophical, right? But I think the coming back to him now, I'm seeing actually no, he's deeply philosophical. In fact, his methodology, the diamond approach, is based in is it's based in Socratic inquiry. It's a
mm.
radical kind of questioning and opening up to the unknown and the dynamics of that, right? I think I'm just appreciating that a lot more. And in this particular book, he's 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 getting at this question, right? He's noticing and he's educing out this problem, right? Which is this way that religions and many other things um, highlight this schism, right?
Mm.
Um, Between something like the personal, right, or the egoic, and the transpersonal or the impersonal. And pretty typically, like each religion does a little bit differently, but the religion in some sense kind of have tendencies at least to look at the ego or the personal is something like an error, right? Or an illusion, or something that it at best ought to be subordinate to the higher.
Right.
And what I'm getting out of the conversation is that really what he's trying to address is that schism, and the sense that he's kind of asking this question about, is it, if, for example, if the true reality, right, is the higher reality, right, if we say that that's the real, and the ego or the little r reality, right, is the lower reality, and so reality is in some sense either dissolving the ego or becoming more of the higher like and becoming more fitted to the higher, however that goes, right?
Sure.
There's a presupposition that in some sense the personal is something like a mistake of some kind.
Mm,
And he's like, well, if that's the case, why does every human being, right, who's ever been born, grow one? They grow a self, right? Why do they all have egos, right? If that's the nature of reality, how come it goes, all of it? Did being like burp, right, for a second and like whoop, and it's been reproducing itself ever since?
I just see the universe burping now and be like,
yes. Like God's like, oops.
Oh,
right?
shoot. Yeah, it's Monday.
Sorry, no take back.
Oh, ooh.
And I think where he's going, so he's going into this dialectic in the pro beyond price, but I think where it's headed is, as far as I can tell, is really considering that what he's calling, his terminology is the personal essence, right? Which is the ground of personality, right? And I think what he would say is that considering that the person or the individual, right, its individuality and its personalness actually is a feature of being.
Yep.
Right? It reflects not a separate entity that then grows a self, but what is it about? Essentially, why did the Big Bang grow a nervous system? Right? There's something, right, that there is consciousness at all, right, and that there are egos, and that there is this sense of personalness that we grow into and develop. What is it about all that is, right, that affords that to be possible? There's something in the structure of being. So I think where he's going is that the personal essence is probably going to start to look like something like an aspect of being itself, right? Rather than kind of a mistake or a distortion or something like that. And but there's that he's essentially addressing that schism or that split. And so that's one thing I've been thinking about. And also the other thing I've been thinking along with Daniel Zarubra is about this notion of the eye of charity. And my understanding of what that is, basically it's a Christian notion, but it's essentially the eye of charity is something like being able to perceive and see, especially in the most dire, distorted, contorted, gross circumstances, to be able to see directly into the good, and in such a way, right, that the self is transformed through seeing it, right, in a kind of self-emptying, right, and in a certain sense midwifes it into the world, right, through its act of charity, right, that transforms the self and transforms the world. And there's something about that. And there's so many experiences I've had in circling, which I think circling sets up the conditions or like the right conditions of possibility for that to actually be deeply experienced by people in a visceral way. So that's part of, I think, what strikes me about it. But just the idea, right? And kind of, as I'm talking about it, thinking about this schism, thinking about what is it to not presuppose that schism, and then try to get yourself out of that self-enclosure, and of the subject, object, higher, lower, all that kind of stuff. I'm wondering if there's something in this eye of charity, right? That 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 in that is a possibility of, in some sense, breaking free of that schism, right, without presupposing it in some way. So those are the kinds of things I've been thinking about.
That's all magnificent. It makes me think of that. Very, very good. It makes me think, the first thing that comes to mind, it is very interesting how all of these religions seem to all agree that there's something about the ego that is bad, but then it kind of begs the question, okay, then why does the ego come into existence, right? It makes me think a little bit. Sometimes people will talk, say, in evolution. It's kind of like, why in the world did consciousness arise? Because it kind of gets in the way of reproduction, and you like guild and conscious, and it kind of gets in the way of some genetic spread. Arguably consciousness is bad for evolution. Right now, some people are now arguing, well, it's because evolution moves into the social, and then it's primarily social evolution. You can make those moves, but there is something strange where it's almost like consciousness kind of gets in the way of biological evolution. Now, I'm not an expert in that field, but I've heard that argument. In a similar way, it does seem very strange and the other thing too that's interesting is if millions of people ascribe to these religions and kind of agree with the teaching that the ego is bad, and yet they still tend to fall into individualization, egotistic thinking, regardless of that teaching. It makes me think that there must be something natural about the brain to create it. It must be easy to create it. It must be something that we just do even when we think that we're not doing it, right? It would suggest that its existence is ironic. That the very acts that help us think that we're escaping the ego are the things that produce the ego. But the other thing that it makes me think is it would seem as if perhaps the ego, if we just use that language, is a necessary component of the transcendence, right? Where it's not actually something you escape into transcendence, but something you have to rightly order so that you can access transcendence, right? Like if there was no ego, that wouldn't be an option. Hegel makes this interesting argument where he tries to say that it's not finite versus infinite, but that the finite is the condition that makes possible the infinite. If there was no finitude, there would be no infinite, because you wouldn't have the precondition necessary for something to become infinite, which for him then gets into kind of the relation of true infinity, where a thing relates to itself truly, as opposed to engage in a spurious infinity, as he calls it, where it's always escaping itself. Like a spurious infinity is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You just list it out forever. A true infinity is almost like a circle, where a circle infinitely relates to itself and it keeps going on, but it's not spurious because it's always engaged in an active relation. So it's true. It's helping facilitate the truth of the object, because a circle would not exist if it didn't have that infinite relation, right? So the thing is, without finitude, there'd be no possibility of circles, and therefore no possibility of true infinities, right? You have to have finitude for that. Likewise, it would seem as if you require the ego to have something to undergo transcendence, right? Or something to undergo a state where the ego is then somehow transcended. Now, what's interesting, this would almost be a phenomenological question. In, say, a experience of transcendence, is it that the ego dies or that the ego forgets itself? Because very often the language of religions is that in a transcendent experience, the ego dies, right? It like goes away. And maybe that's what in a sense occurs, but maybe it's instead more where the ego stops thinking about itself, and that actually that very forgetfulness is necessary so the transcendence occurs, because the transcendence occurs in a kind of self-forgetfulness, is a term I like to use, where there has to be a self, though, to forget. Well, this is interesting because then it makes me think of the eye of charity, because in order to really see the good in another person and to somehow in that act of seeing help bring it out, you have to forget yourself to really, really look into the good of the other person, to really see it. And you have to forget also all of the things in you saying that, but wait, no, they're not that, because look, they're crumbing. What's so also interesting about that eye of charity is it's kind of delusional, right? There's something delusional about it, because you're kind of denying the crumminess of the person, and yet that very delusiveness, that very denial of reality is precisely what makes reality better. And I think what we're kind of because then I think it also shows how we are the conditions of one another. Like the way we act contributes to the conditions that other people experience and live in, of which transforms who they become. Like we're kind of actively conditioning the people around them. And if we just choose to see them as, say, a mistake or mess up, well, then we act in such a manner that conditions them to indeed be that. But if we're able to see a potential good there, well, then we can act and condition them in a manner. And it makes me think how we're always in the business of conditioning one another, how we're always in the business of determining what kind of horizons people have and what they meet. And if we are able, then if there's something about the eye of charity that has something to do with a kind of self-forgetfulness in the act of being completely lost in the other person, there's something in that of which points to transcendence, of which is only possible, though, due to the ego. So maybe part of it, I'm not sure, and I'll give it back to you. Maybe it's almost like a phenomenological description has occurred that's erroneous. That could be an angle where religions are saying, oh, in the transcendent experience, the ego goes away. It's erased. Therefore, the ego must be bad. Because if it goes away in transcendence, you would conclude that it's therefore bad. Where maybe instead what happens is the ego forgets itself. Like it loses sight of itself. And therefore you can't say it's innately bad. It's that it has to be conditioned to engage in a practice of forgetfulness where it is lost in something other. And if it wasn't there, it couldn't engage in that practice. And likewise, if we didn't have egos, we couldn't do the eye of charity for one another because we wouldn't have a self by which to engage in that sort of act. So it makes me think of perhaps some of the thinking. It's more of an issue of ordering that we need to think, not an either or, ego's bad, transcendence good, as opposed to saying, no, the ego is the condition that makes possible transcendence if it is rightly acting, if it is rightly ordered. And likewise, we say, oh, the finite is the condition that makes possible the infinite if it is rightly ordered. And I like to think in terms of what I call conditionalism. Like there are conditions that things in holding themselves in a certain way make possible that if they do that, well, then they open up to the transcendent. But if they don't do that, then they close off from the transcendent as if they are the opposite of the transcendent. So that's almost perhaps part of what ends up happening. Like if there's a failure to have this right horizon, it then even makes it seem like it is it in of itself is why you don't access that horizon, when instead it's an error of conditioning. So those are some thoughts that I had as you were speaking.
Right. Totally. Yeah, totally. It's like, I think one of the things that all the traditions basically have, the religious traditions they all really have models of kind of the structure of selfhood or soul or ego, right? They all have, in different ways, have that drawn out is like, what is the self or the soul, right, in its relationship to everything else as a structure, right? Some of them emphasize more of it as the activity, is a kind of activity. Some of them are more of like, it's more of an entity of a self-image or something like that, or, but it hasn't been until psychology, right, that the self structure, to be able to look and distinguish what your self structure is per se, all the substructures of that structure, right, and its development. It wasn't until psychology that those distinctions were, there was the structure of the ego. So basically the only choice you have is to is to transcend it, to get to dissolve it, to based on how you viewed it, right? However you approached it was given by the structure of it.
Mm.
But and this is where Almas comes in, because he's a psychologist, right? And he's super rigorous. He's a objects relations psychologist. Is super rigorous in his sightings, and technically quite astute with all of this. And so his work is rare in that he doesn't just say, right, the non-dual and the ego are connected or evolved from one another. He actually shows exactly and precisely how that comes online, right, and in full detail. So I think one of the things that we have available now, right, and very recently, right, through psychology, is to actually have this be a question,
Mm.
right? What is spirit? What is the transcendent in relationship, right, to the actual phases of the particular development of the self and how it evolves, right?
Mm.
It's like now that we have some sense of that, right? What does that open up in terms of our relationship to the transcendent, if you will, right? To spirit. And I almost goes, in his school, the way he goes about it is essentially you go through the minutia of your psychology, right? You go into like deep inquiries into, for example, your very sense of the holding, like in the Wincottian sense of the word, the holding environment, right? Like almost would say that holding environment, i.e., essentially your parents, um, was the first it was the first face of being.
Mm.
And therefore, right, how that development went, right, is going to radically structure, right, your basic sense of the way essentially the logos holds things together, right? If that's shaken in some ways, and there's all kinds of different ways that could go wrong, right? Especially when you consider we are, as human beings, we're the most, like, literally probably the most pathetic and helpless, right? Useless.
Oh,
The
sure.
infant is almost, it's like it's almost like pure potential with no actuality, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? You can kind of suck, right, if it's lucky. But so everything comes for us in and through these relations and this development, right?
Mm.
Um, and so like you do things, right, in that work, you do things like these kind of inquiries into starting to notice what is what what is your background sense of trust, right? Like, do you have a basic trust, right,
Mm.
in that fundamentally that things are okay, right? Right? Or are there is there a sense of conditions about whether or not it's okay, right? Um and I think his sense is, and I would agree with this. It's like first holding environment, mother's belly, second holding environment, right? Your childhood, right? Third holding environment, your adulthood, i.e., the recreation of where it didn't go right in the second holding environment, i.e., your childhood, so that you can then try to resolve it, thereby presupposing it,
Yeah.
right? In some sense. Yeah, so like it's really interesting when you kind of look at it from this standpoint, just considering your basic grip on the world, your basic orientation, the way that your nervous system relaxes back into, right, and orients toward the world, that basic kind of in John's language, agent arena sensibility, right? Um, is for the basics of it is formed really like really early, right? In some sense. So
Mm.
so going into like if you go to it like a diamond heart, which is his it's his that's the name of his, I think it's actually officially a church, but it's like a spiritual path. You know, you'll spend the weekend and you'll see people like kind of eyes closed going into these deep inquiries, right? Where there'll be paired exercises. You'll see them meditating, but kind of going deep into an inquiry into these um, essentially distinguishing and discerning out their self object relations, right? And then working in groups, and like of course those things come up and you project them on other people, and then you work through that stuff in the group, and it's these, you know, it's quite apparently it's a pretty intense process.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there was a few things you said that outstanding. It makes me think there were parts in the video where you mentioned on based on Almus's work, this kind of interesting dilemma of how we believe we come to know what it means to be human and we never think of it again, right? We just, you know, we know what it is to be human and we're done. And that's part of the problem. And it's kind of the Heideggerian everydayness, right? Where stuff becomes everyday and you just go from there and nothing strikes you anymore. There's no more wonder, there's no more awe in anything. And it makes me wonder if there's something about everydayness that is trying to return or regain that hold that the mother had, where certainty itself is kind of like, oh, I want to be held by the world and it can't surprise me, right? It's safe because it can
Yeah.
hold me. But it's misguided because it's actually when your mother held you, she smiled and loved you and filled you with beauty. But when you misguide that and direct that toward the world to be something that is reliable or it's going to hold you, it actually cuts you off from the wonder. Whereas with your letting your mom or your parents hold you is actually precisely the precondition of being open to the wonder, because now you're safe and now you're open and things can come from there.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if like the desire for certainty is almost a kind of misplaced desire to be held again. And then maybe one of the reasons.
Hello, Mr. Descartes. Right.
But yeah, well, you know, and well, hey, you know, it's interesting you bring up Descartes because I've been studying a little of like the historic moment, and it's interesting where Descartes is almost like, oh man, for all these hundreds of, you know, thousands of years, we thought the sun spun around the earth. We thought we knew all these things, and it turned out to be like, we will never again believe something for thousands of years that is false. So I'm going to find the things that we know can hold us and go from there because of that fear of being deceived for you know another 1,000 years with a misidentification of the solar system. And for me it was interesting to think about Descartes' project as a kind of historic response to finding out that mankind believes something, you know, something so with such conviction that was wrong for thousands upon thousands of years. And that kind of put Descartes for me in a new light, because it's like, oh, we don't want science to go astray again in Aristotle. You know, we don't want our view of the universe to go astray again. And so then instead of Descartes being just some foundational project, can we find, you know, a foundation that's reliable? It's like, can we be safe again? You know, can we be held again? Can we be, you know,
and it's right at what we were just talking about.
And it's very interesting to think of Descartes that way, as what can hold us that we won't be frightened about. It's like, what parent can hold us that won't drop us or scream at us suddenly, right? And it's interesting to read Descartes in a kind of parental way. And also perhaps a reason why the eye of charity is something that we may avoid or not like, you know, naturally or something, is because the moment you say, I have the power to look at someone in a manner that sees them different from how they are, well, then the world becomes a place where you have that power, where it's no longer something that holds you, but something that you actively hold and change how you hold it. So the agency kind of comes on you. And maybe there's
Yeah.
something about aging that is moving from a place of being held to a place of needing to become someone who holds or takes
Yeah.
responsibility for
Yeah.
holding. And we don't like that. But you see, what's interesting is from a developmental framework, and I think this is Hegelian as well. In a development framework, there are things that are good to do at a certain age that if you do the same thing as an older age, it causes problems, right? Like
Yeah.
there has to be a development and change with that development so that things that in the past were good don't be overfit in the future in a manner
Yeah.
that's problematic. So and that seems to perhaps be what ends up happening when we fall into everydayness, because what we're doing is trying to return to being held by the parent, by something reliable, but we apply it to objects and the world itself as opposed to, say, maybe people. We don't want to be
Yeah.
vulnerable to people, right? Because that, which that's really what we need to be doing. And the eye of charity would also then, if we did that, unveil to us that we can hold people and change who they are based on how we hold them. And then
Yeah.
before giving it back to you, I think this is all this kind of thinking, which I think has philosophical ramifications, I think suggests the change of philosophy that's going on, which is that philosophy is now partly informed by psychology, partly informed by maybe globalization, all different things. It's becoming, I think, in my opinion at least, that a non-contingent universal general philosophy that's looking for kind of stable presuppositions is problematic. And instead, a
Yeah.
philosophy of the art of conditions, the art of holding. I know Dr. Viveki would talk about grip with some of the phenomenologists, which is very good.
Yeah.
That is where philosophy needs to go, and it is going there. And as it goes there, I think you start to
Yeah.
see the overlap with psychology and development, because they're kind of converging in some respects on that grounds of conditioning and conditionalism.
Right. Right. Oh, totally. It's like what you're saying is there is I think you're right about that this kind of sense of a ground, right? I mean, it's becoming less and less possible to even be able to see that, right, anymore, right? There are more of this sense of a dynamic activity, right, or a relation, right, that is kind of irreducible to any kind of thingness. And it's interesting because when you think about, pre-modernity, there's that sense of that agapic love, right? The parent has for the child, right? It like affords the child to become a person, right? And then that they become a person, right? Then they in turn, right, give birth to a child, and then but at some point the mother and father, the parent, the one that held them was God, right?
Mm.
And just the whole structure of marriage, right, had that whole sense about things, right? So there's this other element right now where, in some sense, like what is it? What is it, right? To in this age, where do we get that sense of holding? Where, like, just that question of where does that come from? Because we have one, right? Whether or not you know about it or not, or think about it or not, right? It's a miracle that we don't spend that we spend more than like a few seconds not completely anxious out of our minds, right? Considering all the things that could go wrong, right? So we have a sense, right, of something, of a holding, like that. It's like most people aren't anxious about the next breath, for example. We can have a preconceptual trust, right? Merleau-Ponty I think talks about it as like he calls it perceptual or phenomenological faith, right? That there's some sense, right, of an experience of givenness, right? That we have probably like a pre-thematic faith in. And the way that was structured by the Christian mind, right, in the Middle Age mind, was in terms of that, right? But what is that now, right? I think that's a really good question of like, how do we understand that, right? What is the holding environment now? Where do we seek it? How do we understand it, right? Is it going away, right? Is it dissolving, or like in some sense, are we running on the fumes of Christianity, right? In many ways, like most of our institutions are essentially arose in and through a Christian context, right? And what does it mean? What does it mean to lose, at a very deep level, like lose the belief, right? The source of those institutions, and still have the institutions, right? Those institutions, in some sense, are supposed to be kind of a holding environment, right? What I think it's just really interesting just to contemplate what, I don't think it's I wonder if it's even possible for us to actually perceive how weird it is that we're becoming less religious, right? Or I don't know if we can become less religious, that we aren't religious, right? Like that's different. It's only been a very short period of time since that's taken place. And I just don't think I bet we just don't even have the ability to perceive how fucking weird that is, being in the time that we're in, that there's a lot of people walking around that really walk around and don't even think about the greater context, right? Of like, it's not even that they're not religious. They don't even have a category or a mind, right? That has it as a category to even think about exactly, right? But by what means do they relate to the whole, right? In some sense, and what gives that, right? If it's not, in some sense, given by the historically and the traditional and the religious, right? It's fascinating to think about.
No, I think it is extraordinary. Nietzsche always said that the shadow of Buddha, right? People don't even realize that Buddha is dead, the God is dead, and
Yeah.
that whole parable is, it's very important. It's the people in the crowd who are atheists, not necessarily the madman. He's like, you guys don't believe this and don't even know you don't believe this, right? Like, you don't even realize that this has occurred or what the consequences of it is. And the later Nietzsche, especially book 5 of the Gay Science, can be seen thinking through the implications of what it would mean if God did not exist, and what that would exactly entail, and how would you think from there. And I think the implications of that, like The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. Taylor wants to say you're in a disenchanted age. He tries to make the argument that secularism did not lead to the loss of religion, but the Nova effect, an explosion of religious options. My only critique of that is I think that's kind of true, but it's also undergone inflation, meaning there are more religious options, but they actually lose their stickiness or their ability to have sustaining power. Sure, there are more options, but it's not merely options of religion that make religion religion. It's their capacity to bind, and not just bind in terms of preference, but bind even when you don't like it. Like a religion has authority even when you don't want it to have authority. That's kind of what makes it a religion. That's also what can make it risky, of course, because then it can control you. But that's also why it can be a quote unquote ground, is because it's there even if you don't want it to be there. It's not contingent. So I do have critiques for the Secular Age by Charles Taylor, but that's another topic. A few things. One, I think for a long time, there's often been a stress on the question of God in terms of who created the universe. You know, a lot of emphasis on creation and cause and effect and the first cause. Well, there's another tradition or another line of thought, in especially medieval philosophy, that is the question, the notion of God as the sustaining of being, not merely causing it, but kind of the ground that sustains being. Now, ground is a metaphor for it, but sustain can also be taken as God is the final cause and he pulls things toward it, even if there's nothing underneath it. Like, you know, you could be pulled through a void, even if you don't have ground, if there's something pulling you along, right? So there were different traditions on how being, the ground of being itself, you know, God went by different names, how it carried out this sustaining act, right?
Yeah.
And an interesting image is, say, if you fight like in Christianity with the Trinity, where the persons of the Trinity sustained one another almost in an act of mutual love. Like, it's not that they were standing on one another as if like the Holy Spirit, the ground of the Holy Spirit is the Father and he's standing on it, but it's this mutual act of the Father is loving the Son and the Son is loving the Holy Spirit, and they're like lost one another. C.S. Lewis describes it as a kind of dance. And I think what we're seeing today that's interesting is a movement to philosophy, and I mentioned to you before we talked, of a way I put it is there's a notion of the possibility of ground is no longer there, which would be presuppositional philosophy. It's almost like now you have a kind of intersuppositional philosophy. A philosophy for what sustains us is what emerges between people, what emerges between us and things. It's not that, so it's almost like you mentioned the subject-object divide. And basically the effort to say have presuppositional, you know, grounded philosophy by crossing that divide is no longer the case. So the suppositions have to arise in the divide itself. Like the divide itself is the place of the supposition, and what can happen if there's a certain way that people approach that divide and condition themselves relative to that divide that can't happen without the divide. So then what starts to happen, you start to think, okay, instead of trying to cross the divide, what are the creative possibilities that can only occur because of that divide, right? So, and another way to think about it is if it's not possible to have a ground, well, then we can ask, what is possible because we don't have a ground? What can happen in a universe without a ground that couldn't happen in a universe with a ground? Well, if you don't have a ground, then your creativity is not bound, right? There's no necessity of, there's no necessary limit to creative unfolding and creative possibility if people engage in the acts of relating so that that creativity may come out and being much more
circles.
Well, that would get into things like circling. That would get into a lot of Hegel's thought of thinking categories before categories. For me, you mentioned Monty, you know, phenomenology of perception. One of the things about that book that I think is so critical is how he points out that all rationality is basically conditioned by one's phenomenological approach. What is rational to do to that bookcase is different if I'm standing right in front of it, from if I'm standing 5 feet away from it, from if I'm standing behind it, if I'm standing to the side of it. There is no universal way to treat the bookcase because it's completely relative to my positioning in space and time. And he goes through all of these different, he really wants us to rethink what does it mean to even engage in philosophy, because philosophy is always phenomenologically conditioned. So for me, you know, and it's really important. And then to pass it back to you, what I think the first thing is that I don't think we really have begun to think of what it means to not believe in God, because actually we still have a culture of looking for presuppositions. We still have a culture that thinks rationality is not conditioned by its phenomenological condition, and it's not intersuppositional. At the very least, you know, if one were to think of God in terms of, say, like a relational dance, like we talked about, as opposed to a ground, this would change how we behave. And I do think, and then I'll give it back to you, that we do need to think, we really do need to think outside of terms of grounding into something more intersuppositional, something that I would associate with the Trinity, because it's only a matter of time before the consequences of not thinking it show up. Basically, it would be an entirely another subject, but to be extremely provocative, I would actually say that basically without this effort, politics will end up in Duganism or global capitalism, extremity, totalization. Like, there are actually massive political ramifications for the failure to take seriously intersuppositional thinking, because what happens is a kind of revenge of returning, of a revenge for grounding, a revenge to deal with the meaning crisis by reestablishing grounding. And that can just look like a return to nationalism. Not to say nation states are inherently bad. There's a difference between a nation state and nationalism. Now, you'd have to get into all of those differences, and that's an entire political science stuff. But I think it's actually, I actually think the movement into intersuppositional, if you just grant me that phrase, is basically utterly necessary if you're going to have, because both, say, in America, conservative and liberalism are just returns to different grounds in different terms. They're both like, rather it be in a ground of identity in kind of liberal terms, or in conservatism, it can be a ground of a nation state or a tradition that you want to get back. Both of them, because both have truth to them, right? There is good in tradition and there is good in identity, but there's a difference between a tradition that is in service of something intersuppositional, an identity that is in service of something intersuppositional, as opposed to in service of something presuppositional. And basically, and then I'll give it back to you, everything, if indeed so much of the question is a matter of order, then everything that's quote unquote good, such as tradition or identity or freedom or justice, you name it, if it's in service of trying to return to a ground, it will prove neurotic and problematic. But if you take those same values and try to put them in service of something intersuppositional, well, then we can start making the moves that we need to make to avoid the different neuroses. So that, you know, those are thoughts.
Totally. Wouldn't you say that in a certain sense, this intersuppositional? I like that. I like that turn of phrase, intersuppositional. You know, in some sense, it's interesting because now that the possibility to think in those terms are here, right? And in many ways, as you're talking about, make a lot more sense, right? Are definitely more sense-giving in our time, right? What's interesting about this is it's so strange because essentially we're also talk intersuppositional is to basically is to notice a priority in relation, or relation is now the it's the no thing, right? And which I think is really right. And what's interesting is in some way, I'm wondering, this is because it's also really strange right now, is that for the first time in history too, we like community is an option. Like literally, like it's an option right now. Community is an option that you can take on or not, right? But it's not given by the necessity of living, right? For the most part, right? So what's interesting is, in fact, I just saw some, like, a bunch of recent studies came out It's on a news clip. I have it here somewhere, but it's basically showing that people just don't have friends anymore, right? And they're not even, they're not even striving to have friends,
Yep.
right? Which is strange. And they're suffering tremendous amount of isolation and loneliness. But it seems to be, you would think loneliness in the sense of isolation would make someone hungry to form relationships. But this kind of loneliness, right? And this kind of isolation doesn't seem to drive a hunger towards relation.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which is just really interesting, right? But it's funny, I'm kind of seeing kind of an opening here though, in what you're in some strange paradoxical way. I can kind of just see the glimmers of this, of that maybe this is precisely in that community, right, is not bound up in necessity, right, more than it's ever been. That very necessity, right, we can now start to actually come into community on like some kind of different basis that's not given by tradition or necessity or something like that. There's an interesting, it's interesting this way, right? Like right at the time where we have less relationships than we've ever had, are the thing that makes the most sense is an understanding of being that is a relation.
Yep.
Right? This what do you think about that?
Magnificent. And it's funny you bring up that study. The book I just picked up, which has disconnected in the title, he was talking about how 50 years ago, if you called people and you asked how many people do you have that would be there for you in a pinch, the average was 4, where people had like 4 people that they could come to mind. And they've redone these studies, and now the most common answer is 0. And it's staggering. And also the book goes through a survey of also saying exactly what you went at when you ask people, hey, how do you think you should respond to not having community? Their answer isn't go form community. It's, I don't know. It's like there's a kind of helplessness, like we don't know what to do. And this is a remarkable shift. To comment on it, one of the things I think is really important for understanding progress in Hegel is that in Hegel, progress occurs through greater difficulty. It is not where progress in Hegel is not things get better, so therefore progress gets easier. Progress actually gets harder. Now, if you do progress, it tends to be better than the past. There is a very real progress in Hegel, but it becomes harder to progress with time. Yeah. And in fact, also the progress is a result of these very strange paradoxical openings. And the one you put out is really, really important. So today, community is no longer given just by your community. That makes possible then a new kind of community that has never before been possible, really, which is one of pure autonomy, right? Pure just choosing. I choose to be in this community because I value it for some reason intrinsic, right? I'm not here because I have to be, but because I see a value in it. Now, arguably, this might make possible a kind of community that is more dynamic and more alive than ever before. It could also make community egotistical because everyone's only there because they like it, right? So, or it could be an impossibility because it is too difficult for people on average to choose a community of their own making and their own values as opposed to simply participate in one that's given to them, right? Most people do not become entrepreneurs. Most people become employees, right? Because it is pretty freaking crazy to start a business. Likewise, most people rather join a community as opposed to start a community or join a small community that is not socially understood, right? Because it's, when people ask you, what did you do Saturday? And you mention your community, and if none of your, family's heard of it, it can be kind of awkward, right? So people, it is not natural to do entrepreneurial things or to join communities that don't have kind of a social clout, if you will.
Yeah.
However, that kind of community is unique. I mean, there's always been the possibility for it, of course, but not in the same way in this historic moment. So Hegel would say that in this kind of historical development, there's the possibility of a community that has not readily been available in previous historic moments, that is more difficult to enact than other forms of community. But if in fact you do enact it, it may give rise to things that have never before been seen. So, for example, if most communities in history have been shared grounds, what we're talking about now are communities that are intersuppositional, that have a shared relation. And what's interesting is that the identity then is what comes out of the relations, not being the definitions that hold it up and say the mission statement or something like that, right? Because one of the things in the past, like let's take, you meant, Christianity. Christian churches had mission statements. They were called creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all the Iota Creed, all these. So they were kind of mission statements, but they weren't merely a mission statement because they supposedly pointed to the very transcendent reality of God, right? Well, likewise, you can't really hold communities together with mission statements that feel to just be mission statements. They have to have a reality to them, right? Well, what's happened is people have become very cynical. They've become very distrusting. They don't really believe. They've seen what, Occupy Wall Street was supposed to make a difference. Didn't really make a difference. There's been all these movements to fix the system, and it hasn't really fixed the system. So people have lost hope. They also, so you've got a few things which, what I'm getting at is why I think people aren't joining community. One, now to do community, you have to go create one and stick your neck out there, which is unnatural. And then people try and they get rejected or hurt. And so they're hurt that way. Two, the other reason is people are crazy busy. They kind of were led to believe that their community could be the people they worked with at their job. And don't get me wrong, you can have relationships with those people, but you need both. You need a community outside of your work and there, but you see the work has spread in the amount of demands on emails and calls, so people don't have time for it. That's another reason. Three, people are spread away from their family. They're not close to their family on average. That contributes to not having it. And then four, the reason is people can't decide what mission they want to be part of because they've also kind of been trained to think that missions don't work out, or they're cynical, or they tend to think, oh, I'm going to get brainwashed into a cult. People are very nervous about joining something that tricks them. They're kind of, they've been, and that comes from everyone is, I think there's a lot of traumas. There's a lot of there's hurt. So when you have that, it's hard to join communities. But what if instead, and then I'll give it back to you, I think the intersuppositional topic is important because if you start saying, but wait, everyone, there are certain things that can arise between people that cannot arise when someone is alone. This community is not merely a mission statement that you're part of because you all believe the same things. No, this community exists because the people here engage in certain practices that make certain things emerge that cannot occur outside of it. And, obviously I'm alluding to dialogos, circling, and all of those different things. Well, if people thought of community as being the only possibility of intersuppositional realities that then change their whole horizon, that would completely transform the imperative by which people join. And that is the community that in this historic moment is possible precisely because community is not necessarily given, right? Because the intersuppositional seems to have something to do with choice, because it has something to do with openness. Like you have to open, and choosing to be there then opens you, which then makes possible all these special intersuppositional phenomenon that seem to be really necessary today. So I think that as possible now in this new way, in this new historical moment, is a kind of an intersuppositional community of which then would kind of make people wait a minute, hold on, there's the possibility of community that's something more than just shared belief. And it's capable of doing certain things that aren't possible elsewhere.
Totally. and it also makes, it's like what I'm kind of getting to is when it's, if the community communes around practices, right, that, as you say, create an ethos or an effect, right, that wouldn't be there otherwise. And then, and then that it have an event like character, a dynamic like character, like a practice versus something like a set of beliefs or propositions or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That I think that makes that there's just there's a level of consistency, right? That just makes a lot of sense. But and also it, I think one of the things that we may be moving into, right, which I think I kind of just stumbled across it through circling and in things related to that. Whereas there's what you discover in those practices is there's a new kind of intimacy,
Yeah.
right? That can happen that I don't think people were walking around. I think the only kind of intimacy that would happen normally is like a sexual intimacy, right? Or romantic intimacy or intimacy with family, right? But there's an intimacy of fellowship, right? That can go quite deep, right?
Yes.
That comes by engaging in these very practices together, right? And they may or may not turn into actual like developed friendships, right? That seems to be a whole other thing. But those friendship can't, like many friendships are developed in and through those practices. But just I think that just the intimacy of the fellowship, which is here, well, I mean, here it is, it's philia, right? That's the love of fellowship. That's the love of cooperation, if you will. Philia Sophia. It's where philosophy comes from. I think circling, in some sense, is that practice of that kind of intimacy, right? In some way. But there's, yeah, it's funny. You're just talking about this. It's just reminding me, like, oh yeah, this is actually why. This is why I'm just more and more. I don't know if the word's convinced, but inclined to create what we're creating with John and the Vervaeke Institute, like Foundation and all of that, and the Circling Institute is actually creating a kind of a model of like a courtyard, right? A virtual courtyard based in virtual, but also have like live events and stuff throughout the year. But essentially having an ongoing community that, I don't know, you pay some
Sure.
minor amount, right, to be a member of, and then you go in and there's practices throughout the whole day of different meditation things and all the circling, right, dialogos, all of these different things. And having that, I think this is why both John and I are excited about this, right? Is really the possibility. This is the possibility of what this can create, and I think you have your finger on that as well. Yeah.
Well, a few things. I've been talking a lot with Cadell, who I adore, on how, Aristotle, the logic of Aristotle. So Hegel in the Science of Logic presents himself as saying, for 2,000 years, we've been using the same logic, and it's now time to update it. If we don't, it's a problem. And a way to put this is that it's not that Aristotle was wrong. Hegel's not saying that Aristotle was wrong. It's the issue that Aristotle's logic fit for what the world faced for 2,000 years. And then when it got to Hegel, due to complexity, and there's a number of things, you needed an update of logic. So there's terms in computer science, and I never know if I'm using them correctly, of underfitting and overfitting. And the idea is that the problem is that to use Aristotle's logic now, Hegel's argument would be to overfit it, to use it to apply to things that no longer work. So likewise, the notion of grounding, philosophical grounding, it worked practically well enough for thousands of years. It's not that it was quote unquote wrong, because there is a sense in which you can call an intersuppositional foundation. It's difficult to find a word that doesn't have an under language to it. It just depends on what you mean. And so that kind of philosophy was fitting. It worked given for what the world was, but now you're entering into with where it's overfitting, where now you need to move into thinking intersuppositionally and communities that are intersuppositional. And if you don't, then you're going to be overfitting the previous model, of which is what's currently occurring. And I would suggest that that overfitting looks like political extremism, splitting, chaos, nihilism, that, you know, to overfit is very consequential when it's no longer appropriate. And so one needs to, you know, the language in Hegel would be to negate, sublate Aristotle into something, you know, it's the change from what I call AA to AB. I'd have to explain all of that. I'll avoid it for now. But there's a need now for moving into that intersuppositional. And another reason why, like to comment on something you said, you know, very often, you've mentioned it, you know, if one time in your entire life, your dad like called you stupid when you didn't catch the baseball, then your life forever becomes a place where your dad might call you stupid. And that forever changes the relationship, right? And that's so often what you'll talk about. It's like people have these incidents, which then forever change the horizon of their relationship. It's very hard to work through. Well, there's also a positive side of that, which is that if you ever encounter a true conversation, I would argue that the high majority of people on planet Earth have never actually had a deep conversation, like not just in an intimate sense, of which tends to, funny enough, there's something about talking philosophy that creates intimacy. Far from philosophy being this abstract, disembodied head on a stick, there's something about expressing one's, you know, the thoughts they've thought on, that they've lived with, that they meditate, that really feels like giving yourself to someone. Philosophy doesn't separate you from people. If you're doing it right, it actually creates intimacy. But anyway, the point is, I would say that the majority of people have never really had the experience of conversation that creates intimacy. I would say that the majority of people have never actually had a truly, truly beautiful experience, like a moment that suspends their categories and they encounter like true beauty. I would say the majority of people who have never been at a party where they're like, wow, this is really a party, not just standing awkwardly around drinking alcohol, like a party, not in a wild sense, but like a celebration. Like I'm always taken by religious festivals, like there's like these celebrations, right? Well, the thing is, if you have once in your life a true conversation, then the world is forever a place where conversations can be like that. You know, once you have a true experience of beauty, then the world is forever a place where beauty is possible. Once you've really had a festival, you know, once you've really been part of that kind of experience, then the world is forever that place. You know, I would say, you know, with the topic of the meaning crisis, literally, if you could give people one of those experiences once, that would be such extraordinary ammunition, you know, force against the meaning crisis, even if they just had it once, because once would forever mean the world is a place where that thing is possible. And so meaning is possible. And so, though for me, in one sense, the fact that, you know, as a parent, the fact that I can say one thing once to my oldest son and forever change the horizon is terrifying. There's another way in which that can actually, that very reality also is extremely hopeful, because it means that if you can have a single experience of beauty, that creates an incredible amount of power and force against feelings of nihilism and meaning. But then the question becomes creating the communities and places where that can occur. And before passing it back to you, one thing as a note, I always think that's very interesting is, you know, when you had churches, that I always find, like, and I'm just speaking Christianity because of the West. So once a week, a bunch of people would get together and sing together. Like, how often today does the average person get together and sing with a bunch of people, right? Like, sing music together. And I
Totally.
often think about the loss of that habit and the loss of like singing music as opposed to just consuming music and singing it with other people in a coordinated fashion to create kind of
Yeah.
harmony. And
Yeah.
how like people have that as a weekly practice, and we
Yeah.
don't sing together anymore. And
Yeah.
and so I do wonder if singing together creates community. There's something about singing together that had a big impact on the church. And the reason I point that out is because I think sometimes one can look at religions as just giving people beliefs. Oh,
Yeah.
they gave you, everyone believed in God and therefore life had meaning because God existed. Well, maybe singing together makes it feel like God is present, right? And so I think you can kind of see in practices like that, oh, the world is a place where 100 strangers can sing together and create harmony. Wow,
Yeah.
the world is a place where that is possible. I guess there's meaning. So that, that's always something I think about, is how people used to get together and sing, every week.
Yeah. It's embodied. Yeah. This kind of way of, in some sense, this, in it's kind of, it's interesting thinking about singing. I think somehow there's a kind of incarnation of some kind that happens, right? When you sing together. And just this idea of just imagining that there's this weekly ritual that, every week for generation after generation, people show up and they coordinate, they coordinate themselves to each other, and then listen into a tonos that they all join in, and then monitor whether or not they're in that tonos in this kind of rhythm. I mean, that's a lot of logos going on there.
Yeah.
It's a lot of logos going on there. Yeah. Yeah. In this kind of sense in which, I mean, in many respects, I think one of the biggest ways, yeah, I mean, you talked about this too, this sense in which there's you're right, the majority of the people in the world don't even know that they haven't had a deep conversation before, right? Or been completely touched by beauty, as you said, like that's actually kind of the norm, and that it just takes once, right, for everything, for a precedence to be set, right, and that for a horizon to open up. Exactly. um yeah, totally. I'm hearing my wife in the
I understand.
background. I think I need to go. Yeah.
I understand. Well, I've enjoyed, well, and I would just say I've enjoyed it very
Yeah.
much. I always enjoy speaking with you, Guy. Yeah, and I would just say, the fact that it can just take once does give me hope. Like,
Oh
just
yeah.
once can change. The fact that if people once, like, if people read a book once and find out that, wait a minute, books can actually change my life, well, then books
Yep.
are forever something that can change your life. If conversations can create intimacy, then conversations are forever something that can create intimacy. So there's a hope in that. I
Yeah.
think, even if there's a converse to it that's frightening, where you can mess up your kids, but there's
Totally.
also a positive that no matter how bad nihilism gets, no matter how bad these things occur, there's that possibility that can open the horizon. And I
Oh,
and I
totally.
and so there's
Mhm.
hope in that. And I do like what Mr. Ebert stresses, because it makes me, on courage as being a lot of what has to do with these things, where he says like the meaning of life is courage. I like where Mr. Ebert says that, and how a lot of meaning, like once a lot of things that hold people back from these experiences tend to be fear, but the one who
Yep.
fears, and that courage can be a big step to opening. I like how he says it just came to mind. But anyway, Guy, I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your
Totally. It's
work.
like they say, just one more thing that is it who is the poet? What's the name of the poet? For an Irish guy, but he said he's a poet that says may you all have a conversation that your little linguistic self can't survive. Right? May we all have conversations, right, that our self, the self that we have going into it, cannot survive the conversation, right? There's conversations that call out transforming one through their listening, through these things. Like, and I think that's the conversation, both metaphorically and literal conversation, especially now with the internet, that we can have these things in itself, is a phenomenon that I don't think I have a feeling we're going to look back at this time with these conversations, and we're going to realize that there was something you could say religious going on in these conversations, enacting a kind of religiosity that I think we're going to look back on and say this was kind of the beginning of that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I've always found it interesting that conversation and conversion are very, very similar. Transformation. I don't think it's by chance that so many religions stress that language creates, and that language has something to do with deepest being. God speaks the world into being. And I think, though, this technology perhaps creates the conditions where it's more easy to see that unfold. Whereas before, you couldn't record it so well. It wasn't so easy. You can see it now. It's kind of like it's almost like Zoom is a kind of canvas, able to capture that more deep essential element of language, thus in of itself suggesting the reality of something intersuppositional and the imperative to turn in that direction. But Guy, thank you, because I'll keep you till midnight. I enjoy speaking to you. Thank you, sir. Best to you, Guy. Thank you, sir. Blessings. Love to you. All the best. Have a good one. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Guy.